There is a reason why running away to sea remains a figure of speech, even perhaps for some put-upon landlubbers an ambition. The open sea still exists in our imaginations as a place where we might be freed from the limits and constraints which bind us on shore. And indeed, even in our minutely monitored modern world, quite a lot of our oceans are still barely observed, much less policed. There is, sadly, a less romantic undertow to this notion. The legal vacuum is exploited not by the buccaneers and swashbucklers of picturesque myth, but pirates of a distinctly modern sort, marauders, mercenaries, smugglers of goods and people, all taking advantage of the world's last Wild West. Does it have to be this way? Can maritime laws be tightened? And if so, can they be enforced? And are there interests in play who don't want to fix the problem? No sane person argues with the idea of human rights on land. Why should they disappear when someone sets foot on a ship? This is the Foreign Desk.
In the Maritime Labour Convention, it does not use the word human rights at all. So we have this great chasm of people not actually taking the rights that you and I enjoy as we sit here, the right not to be attacked, the right to have effective remedy, the right to go to a policeman if something happens, the right for it to be investigated. That does not exist wholesale on the high seas.
The demographics of those who are on these ships, and I'm mostly talking about not merchant vessels, I'm more talking about fishing vessels. Those who work those jobs are generally from underdeveloped countries, very poor, and often undocumented migrants. And so the victims of these crimes are sort of invisible.
Contested boundaries present an opportunity for those who want to operate illegally to do so, because lack of agreement among governments on how to approach the problem and find an enforcement activity around it. So this creates an opportunity for those who are minded to conduct illegally and so doing disrespect human rights.
Welcome to the Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. A brisk education in just how ungoverned the high seas still are may be found in a new book called The Outlaw Ocean, Crime and Survival in the Last Untamed Frontier by the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Ian Urbina. Ian joins us now. Ian, is it basically the case that once you get out of the national waters of whatever the nearest country is and you're in international waters, that it is basically a total free-for-all?
I think that's generally true. There are rules on the books, but very little enforcement mechanisms to make those rules matter.
Does that strike you as weird at this point? I mean, I know that there is an enormous body of complicated and interlocking and sometimes indeed contradictory maritime law, but is it just the case that the resources to actually properly police an expanse that big and that unpopulated don't exist?
So I think there are a bunch of reasons. I think the geography is one of them, the expanse, the lack of resources in most of the places where bad things will happen. Most of those countries don't have navies, much less Coast Guard. And if they do, they can't afford the fuel to be out there policing. I think there are other factors that explain why this is the case. One is the demographics of those who are on these ships, and I'm mostly talking about not merchant vessels, I'm more talking about fishing vessels. Those who work those jobs are generally from underdeveloped countries, very poor, and often undocumented migrants. And so the victims of these crimes are sort of invisible.
I mean, over your years of research into this, you've seen up close a fairly wide variety of malfeasances among what you refer to as the scofflaw fleet, which I was delighted to read as a big fan of arcane terminology myself. But are there particular things that are more common than others? Obviously, the pirates get all the headlines because pirates are a great and picturesque story, but I'm guessing that's not the most common kind of seaborne illegality.
That's right. Yeah, I think the acute crimes, the acute abuses, rape, murder, grab the most attention. But I think the more pervasive ones are less dramatic, but in some ways equally consequential. So the abandonment of seafarers or wage theft, huge problem globally, and essentially involves in abandonment these workers who go, often recruited by manning agencies, companies that get them the job on a vessel. They go work 9, 15, 20 months, assuming all the while and told all the while that the wages are being wired back home. And often those wages are not being sent back home. And sometimes in the abandonment cases, the company that owns the vessel disappears overnight or stops answering their phone. And the captain on that vessel or the crew have no idea what they're supposed to do or how they can get home. They don't have fuel. They don't have papers to offload. So they're stuck. And this is a shockingly widespread crime that can ruin men's lives.
What kind of examples of that mistreatment of crew were you able to get up close to?
So I looked specifically at one case of abandonment that grabbed me. This was a case of a ship called the Donna Liberta, a Greek-flagged ship. It was a refrigeration vessel that normally carried tuna. And this was a ship that interested me because it was sort of a poster child of misbehavior. It had engaged in 3 different crimes of wrongdoing. One was it had used a magic pipe to dump oil into the sea on a systematic basis and had been caught on satellite, imagery doing so. The second one was the ship and the officers had caught several stowaways on board and had put these men at sea on a raft and cut them loose and sort of left them there to die. And then the third category of crime was this abandonment issue. And this ship had a reputation of doing this repeatedly. The owner of the ship had left men stranded on board for months on end without pay and no way to get back home. And so I looked specifically at that ship and tried to sort of tell the stories of those who experienced those crimes.
In theory, I realise that in practice might be a whole other thing, but in theory, are there actually any legal recourses available to sailors who have been mistreated in that way?
So that way is the hard part of the question. So surely on the wage theft issue, the protections that exist on the books for fishing vessel and fishing crews are much lower than those exist for merchant mariners, point one. There's much less unionization, and the rules that apply to fishing vessels are much more lax. Obviously, not paying people for their work is a crime in any industry. But again, as you say, in theory, there are protections that are supposed to prevent wage theft or abandonment. But the realities are that, when a company goes out of business, there's no real recourse in front of the law to force that company to do something because it no longer exists. And there are very few investigators or prosecutors who are trying to track down the owners of those vessels in a third-party country to get those wages paid later on down the road.
Do you get the sense, though, that among the companies and indeed among some of the ship's captains and owners that operate on the high seas, there is still this... They still kind of prefer to think that it is the 17th century, that there is still this literally buccaneering culture. Is there part of that idea that a lot of people actually kind of enjoy?
Yeah, I think both consumers of that sort of metaphor and participants in it actively propagate it, right? So the sea has for long been this metaphor for escape and sort of place that people went to get away from other people and rules and governments. And I think that is a reality and also a perception. And in both capacities, it's what allows for certain cultural things to remain in effect. So, for example, if you think of a pilot of an airplane going from A to B, it would not be surprising to that pilot to be asked whether they had, in real detail, indicated the cargo they were carrying or the crew they were carrying or where they were going, what time they were going to arrive, and the route they were taking, and to leave their transponders indicating their position at all points on. Now jump from aeronautics over to the maritime space. To ask that level of tracking of ship captains is something that in some larger vessels, sure, but smaller fishing vessels, there is not the expectation that they will be indicating where they're going, what they're doing, when they're going to arrive, who they're carrying, what cargo they're going to carry, what gear they're going to use. Those norms are not part of the fabric of that culture. And I think that's part of what allows these sorts of abuses to occur.
I was particularly struck on that front by your chapter detailing your adventures in the Mediterranean, tracking the work of, I don't know how else to describe him, an actual container ship repo man, which, until I read your book, was not a career option I was previously aware was available.
Yeah, neither was I. It's a small niche competitive industry, but it's one in which, there are these men, all of them were men that I met, who are typically hired by lenders, banks or mortgage brokers or whomever, and like standard repo work, their job is to go get that thing back. It's a little bit more complicated in the work because sometimes these guys are called in to troubleshoot thorny situations. So let's say there's a vessel that was carrying, cigarettes and it was in Haiti, and on its inbound it ran into a pier and damaged the pier. And the local officials wanted to take advantage of the situation, and so they levied an ungodly fine that just seems beyond the pale. Maybe the fine was even worth more than the boat itself, certainly its cargo. This is a case where one of these repo men would be called in primarily to try to negotiate the sort of port bureaucrats back down to planet Earth in terms of what they were asking for. But if that doesn't work, then to take matters into their own hands, get on the ship and secret it out of port and get it into international waters.
But seriously, how is that even possible? As you correctly point out, things that have not been paid for do get repossessed, but there is a big difference between repossessing, someone's DVD player and repossessing a not insignificant cargo ship.
Yeah, they're big things typically, right? There's also, most people don't expect them to leave on their own. Ships of that sort are not usually stolen. So there's not a real monitoring in ports of that. And then secondly, you're essentially in this game attempting to get the ship out to international waters, because once you get into that space, jurisdiction shifts and the rules of engagement shift. So point one, these guys, if they can get on board, usually get a sizable head start before local authorities are alerted and they get the guys on the boat and they chase them. Point two, they really only need to make it to the 13-mile mark where international waters begin, because then it becomes much more difficult for the local Coast Guard to stop that vessel and to board that vessel, because now it's on the high seas and that vessel might be flagged to another country. It just was in port in Haiti, but it is a Greek flag vessel. And so usually Coast Guards don't pursue them much further than that. And once these vessels are on the high seas, they're more or less safe to continue their way.
A related question then, I guess, how much of a Wild West free-for-all is security on the high seas? Because I think this was something that was a surprise to a lot of people if they read up on stories about the rash of piracy off the Horn of Africa, when a lot of small Somali craft with very small pirate crews were running in huge ships, and people were just thinking, well, how is that even possible? Not realizing that an absolutely enormous cargo vessel might only have a couple of dozen crew and usually isn't armed. You introduce us to the spectre of floating armories, in one particular case off the coast of Oman. How common are they, and how does that even work?
So floating armories are these weird kind of one part bunkhouse, one part arms depot. They emerged post-2008 to some degree in response to the uptick in Somali piracy. And they were sort of an answer to a conundrum that emerged, which was, on the one hand, after 9/11, rules on bringing weapons or foreign private guards into national waters or into port got tighter because of anti-terrorism fears. Armed guys in national waters was a no-no. On the other hand, there was a real desire to have armed guys on board when traveling through rough neighborhoods. So what do you do, with those guys if you're trying to bring your cargo all the way into port, but you got to get rid of the guys now that you're through the safe, the rough zone? Well, the armories are these floating boats that store the weapons, store the men, and they stay there for sometimes months waiting for their next deployment. And at any given moment, there are about a dozen of them globally that are parked in far off places near rough neighborhoods. And they're just these surreal places that typically are populated by, 2-3 dozen, mostly ex-soldiers, a lot of them British, Indian, from the Central European republics as well.
In the second part of the show this week, we're going to take a wider look at the situation with the law of the sea, or perhaps with the lawlessness of the sea, and discuss what might be done. But from having seen so much of this up close, and it does seem vaguely incredible that in a world as surveilled and explored and understood and regulated as the one we live in, any of this stuff is happening, never mind all of it. Did it strike you that there was anything that could be done if people were properly determined to do something?
I think there's a lot to be done, and some of it's already begun. I think the big missing element is political will.
And is that just because it's one of those problems that just seems either too remote or too big or too easy to say it's somebody else's department?
All the above, yeah. The nature of the space is so sprawling. The nature of the space is jurisdictionally complicated. It belongs to everyone and no one. The nature of the culprits and the victims makes it even tougher. The victims are typically folks from, developing world countries who don't have lawyers or a government that's really looking out for them. They're working on a ship that may be flagged to one country and a captain that comes from another country, and they're in high seas and they're heading to a third country for a cargo that belongs to a company in a fourth country. So when something happens to one of those guys on the vessel, it's not really clear who would take an interest in investigating and potentially prosecuting. And even if you do, your targets are moving, right? They're constantly in motion, the ships and then the players that might have committed the crime. So for all those reasons, I think it's tough. On the other hand, there's a lot going on. All these vessels have to come back to port at some point. There already is the effort to sort of inspect these vessels more closely when they come to port. And more countries are sort of joining a port state control measure coalition that says, hey, look, we're going to team up and say that if you come into these ports, you're going to have to comply with this level of scrutiny. And that's how we're going to ensure that, slavery or murder or whatnot are not happening. There are flaws in how that's executed, but that's a promising step. And then there's, a lot of growing awareness among big buyers, sort of market side pressure being exerted by big retailers and average consumers and bulk buyers who are saying, look, we don't really like the brand risk and the guilt of being complicit in human slavery or illegal fishing or dumping. And so we want to have more clarity on our supply chain and know where it came from and who handled it. And so, those sorts of players, those companies are usually trying to figure out how they can do that better.
Ian Urbina, thank you for joining us on the Foreign Desk. The Outlaw Ocean is available now, published by Bodley Head.